Three of Donald Trump's former advisors are indicted. The probe into Russia's involvement in the US election is digging deeper. So whose name could be unearthed next? And could this investigation sink the US president's administration? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Critics of Donald Trump have been calling for his impeachment since he became the US president 10 months ago. Now, some say a step has been taken in that direction. Three of his former advisors were charged with federal crimes on Monday, including tax evasion, conspiracy against the US, and lying to the FBI about contacts with alleged middlemen for Russia. And that's the key word: Russia. Trump's opponents say the indictments show Trump's campaign worked with Russia to influence the 2016 presidential election. The White House denies this, Trump describing the investigation as a witch hunt. But how far will it go? And could Trump's administration be on shaky ground? We'll get to our guests in just a moment. But first, our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, has this report from the US Capitol.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
Donald Trump has been in office less than a year, but this is perhaps the most significant day of his presidency so far. On Monday, two of his former associates avoided handcuffs and turned themselves into the authorities in Washington. The first is Paul Manafort, the former chair of Donald Trump's presidential election campaign. The other is Rick Gates, a longtime business associate of Manafort's and worked with the White House until March. Both men appeared in court pleading not guilty to a dozen charges. They include conspiracy against the United States, also to launder money, acting as an agent for a foreign principal, providing false statements to investigators, and failure to report foreign bank accounts.
There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government.
The announcement, which caught many off guard, that a third person tied to the Trump campaign, George Papadopoulos, had pled guilty to lying to the FBI. That was over the timing of his meetings with alleged go-betweens for Russia. He is now cooperating with the special investigation led by Robert Mueller. As with Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, the White House is pushing back, diminishing the role of Papadopoulos as a foreign policy advisor.
This individual was the member of a volunteer advisory council that met one time over the course of a year, and he was part of a list that was read out in the Washington Post. I'd hardly call that some sort of regular advisor.
However, it's the case of Paul Manafort which is getting the most attention. The indictments paint the picture of a man living a lavish lifestyle. When FBI agents raided his home, they even photographed his suits as evidence of money laundering. More than $75 million of foreign payments through offshore bank accounts. On Twitter, Trump reacted to the arrests. He has repeatedly called the investigation into ties between his 2016 presidential campaign and Russia a witch hunt by political adversaries and the media. Without offering any evidence, the White House says it expects the Russia probe to wrap up soon. And while the indictment states Manafort's charges involve actions from 2016, on Twitter, Trump contradicted the claim, arguing the charges against Manafort emanate from actions taken before chairing Trump's presidential bid. Trump again stated there was no collusion between his campaign and Russia.
Manafort's lawyer calls the charges ridiculous. And on Capitol Hill, top U.S. senators are also issuing statements about the indictments, claiming it is proof the justice process is working. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's go now to our guests. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Melanie Sloan, an attorney who served as founding executive director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. In Taipei, Darrell Feingold, attorney and Republican political consultant. And also in Washington, D.C., Thomas Pickering, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Ross, Darrell Feingold, you've had time now to absorb these staggering revelations and these charges. How's this playing out, do you think, in the Republican Party?
Well, the key thing Republicans, especially Republicans in Congress, but across the United States, are going to continue to be focused on is advancing the legislative agenda that Republican voters elected a Republican Congress and President Trump to pursue. Most notably in the coming days, that's the legislation to enact significant tax reform. And whatever is going on in the White House should not stop Congress from working on these important legislative goals.
Okay, it should not stop Congress, but surely this should have caused a moment of shock and horror and wondering, who's next? What's next? Could this be true?
But that still wouldn't stop Congress from going about its work, or frankly, it shouldn't stop Congress. They have things to do. They have to hold hearings. They have to hold votes. And it would be irresponsible of them to let events in the White House stop them from doing that.
Thomas Pickering, you've been in this business for a long time. I'm just wondering what you make of the developments that we've seen in the last 24 hours and what it means as far as the bigger picture here is concerned.
Well, leaving aside the fact that I'm not a lawyer and I focused on the Russian side, just let me say one comment on Mr. Feingold. I'm sure that he follows Washington closely. There's not been a howling success in the legislative agenda up until now, despite his hopes. And I do see a lot of distraction there. On the Russia side, it's fascinating because while there were claims that all of this took place in respect to Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates, before, in fact, assuming chairmanship of the campaign, it's quite clear from the data and information that some of the money laundering, a lot of it, transcended that barrier. It's also fascinating with respect to Russia as well that Mr. Mueller, I think, led with a kind of sucker punch. He pushed with Manafort and Gates, waited for the reactions, it seems, from the president, no collusion, and then put Mr. Papadopoulos forward, who had obviously admitted to crimes, was clearly, I think, now recruited by the justice system to help them out in pursuing this particular question further. And he himself had played some kind of a role in trying to set up meetings with a relationship with a mysterious Russian professor in London named by some as Mr. Mifsud, and clearly related in some way or another to Oleg Deripaska, among others. So the Russian connection is there, in addition to obviously the early and preceding information on the hacking by the Russian military intelligence service, the GRU. So we have, in fact, a kind of situation in which we have an unrolling piece of the Russia connection continuing on. We have great uncertainty about where this will go. Mr. Mueller is running a very tight ship, as we have seen. We have some indication with Manafort that he's moving up, if you could put it this way, the ladder toward perhaps higher figures, but no certainty with respect to that. And I think a lot of attention this morning and yesterday was focused on this particular issue, perhaps to the detriment of the legislative process.
Melanie, Sloan, I mean, that certainly was a sucker punch, wasn't it? I mean, quite a day of drama, wasn't it? Delivering first Manafort and Gates and then eventually Papadopoulos. I mean, what do you make of how it was all delivered and what is being set up legally now, the next steps?
Well, in many ways, it's the Papadopoulos information that's so much more serious for Mr. Trump. While President Trump has been saying there's no collusion, the Papadopoulos information indicates that he was indeed colluding with Russia. He was working with Russians to try and obtain negative information about Hillary Clinton, which included, by the way, a trove of emails. And that is the same kind of information that Russians then set up a meeting with Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner to, again, talk about this issue of Hillary Clinton-related emails and dirt. So it's clear that we've seen collusion, and also very worrisome for the Trump campaign is the fact that Mr. Papadopoulos has clearly been working with the special counsel for months and months. He was first arrested back in July. This criminal information indicates that he pleaded guilty at the beginning of October. It's released only at the end of October. They talked about him as a proactive cooperator, meaning he may have been wearing a wire or otherwise speaking to other members of the Trump campaign to try and obtain more information. So I think there's a lot more to come, and this is only the beginning.
So does this answer then the question, Melanie, that there was indeed, and does it fit into the legal framework, collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians? Is that it now?
Collusion is just another word for conspiracy, really. And conspiracy would be the criminal element that we'd be talking about. And we're certainly seeing that. That's certainly what Mr. Mueller is setting up. He's shown us that Mr. Papadopoulos was working with Russians to obtain information about Hillary Clinton. We've seen the same thing with Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. The question is whether it will amount to a criminal conspiracy. And I think that's what Mr. Mueller is working on and his team. They're working on, and we'll see much more about that. But it's clear that this is just the beginning. That's the only reason Mr. Mueller would have done what he did, which is have the Manafort and Gates indictments, and then an hour later give us the Papadopoulos information, which includes that information showing that he's been working with the special prosecutor for months and months.
Ross, your comments about Melanie's comments there from a legal perspective, and when do you think it moves from federal crimes to collusion?
They're all innocent until proven guilty. That's the way our justice system works. But regardless, the bar for a conspiracy conviction is extraordinarily high in these circumstances. The fact is that political campaigns, whether it was the Clinton campaign or the Trump campaign, regularly interact with representatives of foreign governments. That by itself is not a crime. Whether they violated the federal statutes with regard to receiving monetary or non-monetary benefits from a foreign party remains to be seen. And one thing that's interesting about the Papadopoulos guilty plea, it really is limited to lying to the FBI, which is obviously a foolish thing to do. And in fact, it's criminal. And that's why he was caught. And as my colleagues on the panel will know, that very often when prosecutors in a Washington investigation can't find a crime, they do catch some of the people involved in lying, and it becomes an obstruction of justice charge.
Melanie, and I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Thomas. I'm just wondering what sort of evidence Mueller must have had to get the jury to sign off on these charges, and where it goes to from here. I mean, did he bring in Manafort and Gates in order for them to speak eventually? Is this a form of leverage he's using against them?
Well, I certainly think he's going to attempt to leverage Manafort and Gates. I mean, looking at the charges, 12 charges apiece, they're facing potentially decades of prison time for these violations. And for white-collar defendants, that's obviously a pretty scary prospect. So I'm sure that he's trying to leverage them and see what they'll give him. Manafort has greater resources, greater ties to Washington. He might be a little harder to break, but Gates might be a little more willing to, who's much younger and at the beginning of his career, may be willing to provide information. So I certainly think that's the goal here for Mr. Mueller.
Thomas, we know now that Manafort was lobbying for Ukraine. How do you think that would have helped Russia if that was the plan here?
Well, he was lobbying for President of Ukraine, Mr. Yanukovych, who had, in fact, a very, very close Russian tie. So it's almost impossible to see that as a purely independent Ukrainian approach. And Mr. Yanukovych was then later, in fact, left Ukraine under difficult and unseemly circumstances, arrived in Russia, and now seems to have been dissed by Mr. Putin. So whatever happened there, it was a clear Russian connection through Yanukovych that everybody, I think, now is pretty much convinced was operative on this set of situation. Mr. Gates worked extensively in Cyprus. Cyprus is, in fact, the home of perhaps more Russian banks than Russia these days, and more people engaged in what one would call promoting Russian economic activity, sometimes on the seamy side. So this is clearly the kind of indication that puts this much more in the Russian lap. Could one blame Russia for wanting to interfere in American elections? Well, it's certainly against our law, as Melanie has pointed out, for that to be done, although the Russian intelligence services don't seem to be in any way held up by that.
Let me just ask you, Thomas, I mean, the Russian foreign minister, excuse me, jumping in here, Sergei Lavrov says Kiev has information about the 2016 U.S. election campaign. He also said that the U.S. should investigate links to Ukraine. How does that fit into this scenario?
Lavrov is the Russian foreign minister. Clearly, what he has to say should be taken seriously. I'm quite convinced, however, that Sergei Lavrov would be in the front and center of denying any Russian interest that in any way at all implicated Russia in an effort to try to, one way or another, influence the American election campaign. That doesn't seem to coincide with the factual basis that is now being developed, and that part of which is exposed. I suspect that there is more to come, that Mr. Mueller is careful, moving slowly, making sure that at each step of the way what he has to do is significant, and perhaps, if we could assume this, moving up the ladder rather than, in fact, going from his best case down the road to the worst case.
All right. Now, the investigation into the Trump campaign's alleged ties to Russia goes back months. The accusations started before Trump even took office, and signs of Russian meddling led President Barack Obama to expel Russian diplomats in December. Then, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn resigned in February when it became clear he'd met with a Russian ambassador during the campaign and transition period. Attorney General Jeff Sessions also met with Ambassador Sergei Kislyak and failed to disclose it. This revelation forced him to recuse himself from the Russia investigation, leading former FBI chief James Comey to take charge. But he was abruptly fired in May. Comey says he was sacked because Trump wasn't happy about his investigation into possible collusion. And then there's also the meeting Trump's eldest son had with a Kremlin-connected lawyer in June 2016. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was also at that meeting. They were allegedly there to get damaging information on his rival for the White House, Hillary Clinton. How nervous do you think those all are, Ross? The Jared Kushners and those involved in the meeting, and Donald Trump Jr.
Well, it depends on the individual and the specific action involved. One of the accusations in yesterday's indictment of Manafort and Gates was not registering as a foreign agent. The reality is that there is a lot of noncompliance with that particular law, and people who are caught out of compliance typically make an amended filing. They typically don't go to jail. The FBI or the Department of Justice typically doesn't prosecute people for this violation. So Manafort and Gates are going to have a very significant defense to build on that. So their advocacy work on behalf of Ukraine, however distasteful it might be to some people in the United States, frankly, that's a normal part of advocacy in Washington, D.C. And if they were non-compliant, they'll argue that we shouldn't be prosecuted. We should just make an amended filing. As for the other personalities involved that you mentioned, again, the issue is going to come down to whether any of their behavior actually violated a criminal statute of the United States. It might seem unseemly that they met with foreign parties, but that by itself is not a crime.
Melanie, what would it take to get that step closer to the Kushners, if need be, Trump Jr., the Flynns?
Oh, I think they're getting closer all the time. I have to disagree with Russ here. The fact is that the Foreign Agent Registration Act does include criminal penalties, and yesterday the chair of the Republican chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Charles Grassley, said that he was pleased that Mueller was actually going to be prosecuting violations of FARA, which are all too common. Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. also have a lot to worry about, knowing that they, too, were having meetings with Russians about damaging information on Hillary Clinton. But also, I think they might all be looking at the Manafort and Gates indictments and seeing all the problems that they had regarding money laundering and tax fraud that stemmed from Mr. Manafort's business interests. And I think Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. may also have some very questionable business interests. This is what Donald Trump, the president, has always feared, that Mr. Mueller would delve into his finances and into his real estate holdings. And Mr. Mueller's allowed to do that. He's got a very broad reign. So I think we might be seeing some of that kind of thing looking at Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. And I think they both have a lot to worry about there as well.
Ross, where does this leave Donald Trump, and what sort of response do you think he is gearing up for? What sort of action is he going to take? And is Mueller in the crosshairs?
Well, we all know Donald Trump's personality and his style, both as a candidate and in 10 months as a president. And we saw that with how he responded via Twitter in the immediate hours after the indictments were announced. We should expect him to continue to aggressively pursue his policies. And frankly, part of that will be aggressively pursuing action in Congress with regard to tax reform in the coming days and other issues.
No, but I'm asking about, is he going to go, look what he did to Comey. Is he going to go after Mueller? And if he does, could there be a constitutional crisis?
Well, the likelihood of going after Mueller is probably low, and I would expect that his legal counsel, both in the White House and externally, are advising him against doing that because it would set off a crisis. There's clearly support by Republicans in Congress to prevent that occurrence. So that would be a very difficult decision for Donald Trump to make, and I think most of the counsel he is receiving is not to do that. The best thing he could do, frankly, again, though, is to continue to do the normal day-to-day activities of president and to cooperate with the special prosecutor, which his lawyers say they are doing.
Thomas, what do you think Donald Trump should do in this state of play? Do you think people like Kim Jong-un in North Korea are more frightened than they ever have been?
I think it's what he should do and what he will do are probably two different things. I think what he should do is to stay quiet, watch carefully what goes on, make decisions along the lines that I think Mr. Feingold recommended of getting his part of his legislative plan through if he can, not go to war with Kim Jong-un, not to go to war with the Iranians, and I think tone down what he's been doing, particularly avoiding the question of the Mueller issue. The Mueller issue came up once before, about 3 weeks ago, and it was clear that it was put to rest, at least for a while. But I can think of nothing that would be more self-incriminating than interfere in an investigative process which he himself set up, which his administration advised people to cooperate with in the past, and now is being, in fact, in whatever way he might be able to do that, totally interfered with, seemingly to his own benefit. And I think that would be a very serious mistake. It would, at least in my reading, particularly even beyond the Beltway here in Washington, create some consternation in the American public about what he was doing, hopefully seriously enough that he would never do that. And as Russ mentioned, I think there are Republicans in Congress who would find this reprehensible. I think the Democrats universally would, for a combination of reasons.
Melanie, I wonder what we're going to see the media doing at this stage. I mean, we've already seen Fox eulogizing about Mueller and then turning him into the devil incarnate. Very briefly, if you will, where do you see the media in all of this at the moment?
Well, I think we're going to also be now looking at somebody else who played a role, Sam Clovis. Sam Clovis was another person in the campaign. That's who it appears that George Papadopoulos was talking to, as well as Paul Manafort. Sam Clovis has a confirmation hearing coming up to be the chief scientist for the USDA, the Agriculture Department, even though he has no science background. So I think we'll see the media digging in a little there.
Okay, and a couple of word responses from each of you. Melanie, is Donald Trump any closer to impeachment or not?
I think there's definitely a step closer to impeachment, if not that, indictment. So I think the walls are closing in on Mr. Trump, and he's going to be panicking, and it'll be interesting to see what he does. As we all know, he can be fairly erratic.
Ross?
There is no chance of impeachment as of today based on these indictments and with the current makeup of the Congress.
And your thoughts, Thomas?
Indictment is a legal act. Impeachment is political and legal. We have to see whether, in fact, there are enough legal facts to carry it there. The question of politics is extremely important. I think until the Republicans who have impeachment in their hands at the moment understand that the base that Mr. Trump seems to be carrying with him is washing away as a result of these facts.
Okay, Thomas, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Excuse me for interrupting. Thank you very much to all three of my guests. Thomas Pickering there with the final words, Ross, Darrell Feingold and Melanie Sloan. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, please go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. Goodbye and thank you very much for watching.